What's your gotta take one for the team story? Story 1. My ex-girlfriend and I worked at a bar in Montreal. She was a waitress and I was bartender. Once in a while, a bunch of rich dudes from the States would come up and flaunt their money to the girls we worked with, buying champagne and such. One night she was serving them and I got cut early and was waiting until she was done. And those dudes insisted on giving her drinks. She was coming down with a cold and didn't want to drink, so she kept feeding me drinks intended for her. Long story short, there ended up being something in the drink, and I blacked out, and I woke up on my apartment floor and my girlfriend on the couch. I'm glad I took that one for her. Well, that's pretty scary, but I'm a little confused as to how the bartender who was serving the alcohol winds up letting something slip into the drink. Because I assume these guys order the drink, right? But then wouldn't they just have to hand it right back to her? And if so, wouldn't she notice something was put in it? As a bartender, she would know better to let a drink get out of sight and then get offered to her, let alone then give that drink to her boyfriend. Not sure I would want to be served by this non-observant bartender. Story 2. When my loving and dear mother went to the hospital last month due to terminal brain cancer, only 2 people could visit for her entire day due to COVID security. My father was one of the 2, and the last spot was between my sister and me. I let my sister have the last spot without debating or arguing. And after 2 days of not being able to visit, they were able to convince the hospital management to make an amendment and let me in. Unfortunately, I missed out on 2 of the last 5 days she had. Story 3. I had a junior developer on my team that made a mistake. He had only been there a few months, and although the mistake was easy to make, it would end up costing the company $40,000. I was a senior developer and relatively untouchable due to a lot of fixed mistakes that others had made. For 2 days, management was talking about who made the mistake and what they need to do, and as soon as I realized who it was, he was unaware at that point that he had done it wrong, I said that I did it. Nobody said another word about it except to me, who quietly explained the correct way to push code changes to the junior developer. Story 4. Calling this a take one for the team moment seems insensitive because I gained a wonderful friendship, but here goes. I worked at a big company and in a local team of about 90. One of my direct reports lost a long battle with cancer. I was close to him and gave a eulogy at his funeral. Horribly sad. He had a wife and 2 daughters. He had a friend who I didn't know beyond her name, but I knew that they were tight because they always took breaks together. She happened to be off-continent when he died. It was somewhat sudden, and missed his funeral. She wasn't a particularly warm person and was a bit standoffish when I'd see her in communal office spaces. I have a busy life and had trouble with the idea of supporting what might become an obligatory friendship. But she seemed different after his passing, and so after a month I sent her an email and said something to the effect of, I know we don't know each other well, but we both know our friend well. I don't want to be presumptuous, so feel free to ignore me entirely, but if you ever need a friend, I'm here. She responded, and we became casual friends. And she ended up telling me that, in her words, she reached out to the universe that week for a reason not to take her own life. I guess my email arriving the next day was the sign. She has never said this, but I think she was pretty in love with our mutual friend, and he was her main social connection. She is a wonderful person and very kind and very committed to her relationships, despite having only a few. She is fiercely loyal and defensive of her friends. I admire her greatly. We're not a match in terms of our interests or personality, and somehow I feel like a stand-in, there to get her through week after week until she decides on her next direction. I am happy to be there for her, and she teaches me a lot about myself. She listens to me when I'm sad too, and it's been a while and I should check on her. Update, checked in on my friend. I told her I was cleaning my garage and remembered our snowshoe adventure from a few years ago. She said, hey, thanks for thinking of me and that she was doing well. I found out that while we were all working at home, she had moved to a place that is a 5-minute walk away from my place. We're going to go for a stroll and I'll introduce her to my 1-year-old. The story is a good reminder for all of us to listen to the universe sometimes. Regardless of what your religious or spiritual beliefs are, I think it's hard to deny the fact that the world has a way of just dropping things into our lap and making us realize stuff. Clearly, this woman was lucky enough to be listening in her dark moment, and it probably saved her life. But I wonder how many other people are a little bit more close-eared and unaware. Assuming that you're not a crazy person, don't forget to listen to those little voices in your head. Story 5. A buddy was married with 2 young children who was unable to get away from his job, wife, and kids. His wife is also a bit of a helicopter wife, if that makes sense. My buddy and I have a bond over baseball, hadn't seen him in a long time, so we went to a Blue Jays game. During the game, his wife constantly texted him, reminding him he had to come straight home when the game was going to be over. My buddy stated, "It's a Saturday afternoon, I haven't seen you in ages or been out in a while, and I want to go to a pub after for drinks but need an excuse that will give me an extra hour or two." On Saturdays, the Jays would have Junior Jays Saturdays, where 45 minutes after the game, if you were 12 and under, you could wait in a long line and run the bases. I told my buddy to tell his wife that I was trying to hit on a hot single mom who had a baby, but also a 4-year-old who wanted to run the bases, and offered to take the 4-year-old around the bases with the intent to get her number. Mission accomplished, as we headed after the game for a couple of beers. A month later, I was at his house, and the first thing his wife says to me, "You are such a pathetic sleazeball." Story 6. I was at Universal in Florida with my best friend and our 2 boyfriends, waiting in the line for the Hulk roller coaster. It was 97 degrees Fahrenheit and the air was like soup, and we had already waited in line for an hour. I was feeling a little overheated, but was ready to wait it out when I took a look at my best friend who looked white as a sheet, like she was about to faint. I finally called it and said, "Hey guys, I'm not feeling it. Steph, do you want to grab some food and shop in that store with the good Harry Potter stuff?" I could sense the immediate relief from her as we walked out of that line. Her boyfriend is a Florida native, and she was trying to put on a brave face, but I knew 2 more minutes, and that chick would have passed the heck out. We ate ice cream and shopped while we waited another hour for the guys to get through the line to ride the 2-minute roller coaster. Totally worth it to take the weak title for myself to bail. That was a heads-up play by that friend. No roller coaster is worth a near-death experience in the humidity of Florida. It's not like you can enjoy the roller coaster much if you have to be revived with smelling salt and an ice shower. I could be wrong, though, because I personally have never ridden on the Hulk coaster, but in the comments, has anyone ridden that coaster who can say whether it's worth multiple hours of waiting in the scorching heat? Story 7. My best friend convinced me to have a couple of drinks together, and next thing you know, I'm carrying him on my back at 1 a.m. to his house, and we were 16 at the time. Police came and arrested us. It was when quarantine first started in Greece, and nothing really happened with the cops. They just phoned our parents and waited. Both of our parents came to the police station. They asked whose idea it was. I knew that if I told him it was my friend's idea, he would be screwed, so I just told him that it was mine. I got grounded for like 2 weeks, and he got grounded for 1. And I actually told my father a while ago that it was his idea, and I took the blame for him. He laughed and said, "My son is a loyal friend." Story 8. I was out with a bunch of my friends, and the designated driver effed off and left us about 10 minutes into the party. I did not have my license, but I knew the people I was with, and I knew that they would drive drunk. So I didn't drink, and I drove them home. Got pulled over by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. He asked for my license and registration, and I gave him the registration but said I didn't have a license. I had let my beginners lapse and didn't get it because I didn't have a regular access to a car. He started in on me asking why I was driving without a license, and I pointed to each person in the car and said, "Drunk, drunk, drunk, drunk," and I didn't drink. He gave me back the registration and said, "Carry on." Story 9. A bit of a backstory. I was a paid staff at a well-known UK charities furniture shop. Most of our volunteers were disabled in some way, from not noticeable to pretty obvious. A lot of the customers were low-income or Eastern European immigrants, which was usually never an issue. One volunteer in particular was absolutely lovely, and such a sweetie, but somehow he always ended up in trouble and was on the brink of being asked not to return. He wasn't a bad guy, he just got taken advantage of and didn't see bad in anyone else. By this point, I kept him close to me so I could help him out. Also, he was the only volunteer that was 100% reliable and guaranteed to turn up every day. Anyway, one day he was on the till while I filled out paperwork for delivery and collection of the customer to get through the queue quickly, because it was a rare but busy day where we were nonstop. An Eastern European man came up and it was a large order for us, 500 pounds, and he paid cash, but he kept swapping the notes about. So he would give like 20, 10, and 5-pound notes, and then would swap the 5-pounders for a tenner or 20 or 5s, etc., and eventually finish screwing around, and the volunteer must have lost track somewhere. And because by that point it was stupidly busy and the queue had built up from this guy messing about, he didn't double check and accepted that it was still the correct amount. That night, when we paid staff, we were cashing out and were 100 pounds short. Crap. There's 5 of us, and we all take turns counting out just to make absolutely sure because this is a big amount that would need to be reported. Everyone's sitting there wondering what happened, and as I was on the desk pretty much all day because I was the one with legible handwriting even when rushed, so of course it fell on me. I could have thrown volunteer under the bus, but instead I told the staff a half-truth about the guy screwing about with the payment, but instead of saying that the volunteer had dealt with him, I said that I had. I explained what the dude was doing and said about how we were so rushed that I must have just counted wrong when he was finally done, because we were so busy and I just wanted to get the queue down. Luckily, we were all pretty close and always covered for each other within reason. So I told him I'd be right back, went to the bank, took the 100 pounds out and put it in the till so we didn't have to report it and get investigated, and renamed a new one by the area manager. I also never let that volunteer near the till again, just to be on the safe side. Not a bad plan to take that person off the till, but this is a scam that people pull sometimes. People can get really skilled at shuffling bills around and basically using sleight of hand to confuse the teller, and end up getting more money in their hands than they're supposed to. It can happen so fast that, to the untrained eye, it can be very hard to spot. And when you add the extra stress of everyone else waiting for their turn, you quickly count out the change maybe faster than you should have. This was a pretty awesome gesture by this guy, keeping that poor person from being embarrassed and ashamed. Story 10. I taught at an elementary school in my early 20s. At the end of the year, we would always put on a dance for 5th graders as like a last hurrah before moving on to middle school. One year, we hired a DJ, and it was really great. The kids and families were having a great time. Out of nowhere, the DJ announces a father-daughter dance. Most of the girls pulled their dads out to the floor and started dancing, but not all of them. A couple of coworkers and I noticed the girls who didn't have dads kind of cowering in a corner of the dance floor. So we walked over and started dancing with them. This wasn't a big deal at all and honestly was pretty forgettable, but cut to a few years later and I was attending a college graduation for a family friend. One of those girls was graduating that day as well. She comes up to me and tells me how that meant a lot to her, and that it's one of her favorite memories from school. Story 11. A bunch of friends and myself were going on an 8-mile hike during a group camping trip. Before we left, one of our friends kept voicing his skepticism about being able to complete an 8-mile hike. Now, his girlfriend kept urging him to go because she didn't want to hang back with him, she wanted to hike. So, he ends up going. About an hour and a half into the hike, we are going up a series of switchbacks and the dude just can't do it anymore. He tells us that he is going back. We all kind of look to his girlfriend to see if she is going to accompany him back, and she just turns around to keep moving forward. A couple of us were in the back kind of looking back towards him and then towards the others who are continuing on, and then my other friend says, "Should someone go with him?" And we all kind of look at each other hesitantly. I finally jump in and say, I will go back with him so that everyone else can keep going. I catch up to him, and he says I didn't have to do that, but I tell him that I don't want him to be alone all day. We make it back to camp, and he immediately goes to take a nap, and I end up sitting at camp by myself for the next few hours until the rest of the people get back. I guess I should have listened to him when he said I didn't have to come back with him. Hindsight is 20/20, and sure, this guy made it down the trail just fine on his own, but if you consider the alternative possibility of him passing out from exhaustion while all of you hike your happy butts to the top, that probably won't feel good when you come back down and find him. Clearly, everyone was thinking that he needed an escort, but no one had the heart to actually volunteer, except our hero of the story. So bravo to you, sir. And all things considered, it's not the worst thing in the world to have a quiet campsite to yourself for a couple of hours. Story 12. Kind of a gotta take one for the team, but it's a pretty bad one. I was a freshman in high school and it was homecoming. Our class pulled a messed up prank on this girl who had a learning disability and voted for her to be the freshman rep as a joke, and she won. Well, the guy that got voted to walk with her backed out the day before, and I was second in line. Being a freshman, knowing it was a joke, and knowing I'd have to walk her down with everyone watching, I was mortified, but I did it. I remember my stepbrother giving me crap and laughing at me, and then my stepfather found out what I was going to do. He chewed my stepbrother out and was immensely proud of me. I don't think she ever figured out it was a joke, and she was so happy that night. It was probably the highlight of her high school years, honestly. Some 25 years later, my dad ran into her parents, and they still thanked me to him. You just never know whose life you might touch, so be kind. Story 13. The first year of the pandemic, and I stayed on as one of the junior doctors on the COVID ward because I'm lucky enough not to have any medical conditions, and I live alone. Some of my colleagues would have to make drastic life changes. I remember walking into the tea room and a nurse was crying because her son had severe asthma, so her family was temporarily living with the neighbors. She hadn't hugged her kids in a month. Story 14. I was in Vegas with some friends, and we were at a rooftop club getting bottle service. One of my friends, Ed, hooks up with a girl, and let's call her Nancy. Ed and Nancy really hit it off, and they go back to his room together at the end of the night. The next night, we're hanging out again and having dinner, and Ed has invited Nancy to join us. So she does. So does her angry lesbian friend and roommate, Carol. There's a long backstory that I never really learned. Something about how Carol was divorcing her husband, hated men, was living with Nancy for the time being, and probably had an unrequited crush on Nancy. But I never got the details. Nancy was obviously looking to continue the previous night's activities with Ed, as was Ed. Carol, however, was bound and determined to prevent that from happening, so she'd invite herself along and wouldn't leave Nancy's side. Now, in order to give Ed an opening, I started talking with Carol. We got into an involved discussion about the ongoing Winter Olympics and the super nature of luge and skeleton. It was actually a fun conversation, but while we were talking, Ed and Nancy slipped away. When Carol noticed that they were gone, her demeanor immediately changed. She clammed up and she left soon after. Ed thanked me profusely the next morning. This man deserves a long, slow clap from the audience because he was truly a team player that day in Las Vegas. Now, it's one thing to do this for your friend when your friend asks, but how amazing that this guy actually caught on and recognized the pending conflict and then intervened. He didn't hesitate or worry about the consequences of getting into a heated discussion about the Olympics. He just went with his gut and stuck his neck out. I hope Carol realized how she was duped in the end because it seemed like she was a little overbearing and totally deserved it. Story 15. All right, so there was this one time a few years ago where I was put in a group with two girls, and we had to make a diorama depicting the trial of Louis Riel. It's a Manitoba thing, for the history fair. I spent the 2 weeks leading up to the project messing around, even though I was supposed to do a third of the work. I arrive at school the day of the Heritage Fair to discover that my group mates had also spent the last 2 weeks doing whatever the girl version of messing around is. So now we've got about 10 minutes to make a passable shoebox diorama, and we don't even have a shoebox. One of the girls says, if you can make the teacher say that we don't have to present the diorama, we'll both kiss you. And instead of a normal excuse like, my dog ate it or my grandma died, I proceed to do the single dumbest thing I could think of. I climbed up about halfway up the spider web rope pyramid thing that playgrounds always seem to have, and being the 10-year-old dummy that I was, I threw myself off of it. I hit the pebbles on the bottom of the playground, realized that I had messed up, and began crying and shouting, I fell and I need to go to the hospital, until a teacher carried me to the office where they could contact my mother. I only needed a few stitches, and they still had to present our non-existent diorama. I never did end up getting that kiss, though.